newcomers, thanks for joining us on this rainy evening. The Zoom co-host with me tonight will be Liz Denny. Liz, if you're somewhere, raise your hand. There you are. Liz is going to be handling questions at the end of the program. So if you have a question during the program, if you could put it in the chat. I should introduce myself for people who don't know. My name is Kathy Gow, and I'm the curator of the Hatfield Historical Museum and also on the board of the Hatfield Historical Society. So for those of you who didn't hear before, we are recording this program. We would love to have your faces showing, just because it's so much easier to present to an audience than to a bunch of black boxes. But if you're not comfortable with that, just feel free to click your camera off. And in a minute or two, we're going to be going to the presenter sharing their screen, and your face will be even smaller. So, also just a reminder for folks, if you have your cell phones nearby, if you could put them on mute or turn them off, just so well, actually, that doesn't matter so much, does it? Because I'm going to ask you all to mute. So if everybody except for the presenters could put their mic on mute. And if you haven't done this before, that's just clicking on the little mic icon until there's a line through it. And if there is anybody left who hasn't done this before. So next, I'm going to introduce our president of the Hatfield Historical Society, Bob Osley. And Bob is going to introduce our program.
I'd like to thank you all for coming out. This is our, can you all hear me? Okay. This is our second spring program, and the program is supported by a grant from the Bridge Street Fund, which is a special initiative from Mass Humanities. We will have an option to have you sign up for the Mass Humanities newsletter at the end of the program if you're interested. Just as another announcement, our annual meeting and program will be coming up on Thursday, May 19th, and it will be held at the Hatfield Congregational Church. So it will be a live meeting. And the title of the program will be A Family Affair, Celebrating Multi-Generational Farms in Hatfield. So if you could mark your calendars, that will be our annual meeting, kind of an update on the functioning of the society, as well as annual meeting where you all get a chance to boot people like me out of leadership positions. So take advantage of it. As far as our presenters this evening, we have two presenters, Monica Vachula. She's an artist whose paintings, prints, drawings have been exhibited throughout New England and in many private collections. In addition to creating the illustrations in Jane Yolen's Tea with the Old Dragon, which will be featured tonight. She also did Noah Webster, Weaver of Words, by Peggy Dietz Shea, Longfellow's Paul Revere's Ride, and she's provided artwork on an iPad tour for the Noah Webster House Museum in West Hartford, Connecticut, as well as illustrations for the Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association Impressions of a Lost World website. Monica is a graduate of Smith College and lives in Hatfield. Our other presenter is Meg Baker. Meg has 30 years of experience in conserving and repairing vintage antique textiles for museums and private clients, including she has 10 years museum experience in 3 local history museums. She's a member of the Mohawk Trail Quilt Guild and has given 2 one-woman shows of original quilts. showcasing the textile history of the United States. Meg studied early American textile history and material culture at Hampshire College. Meg is currently the assistant curator at the Hatfield Historical Museum, soon to be the curator. And more about that at the annual meeting. Meg lives in Greenfield, Mass. So without delay, I will turn it over to Meg and Monica.
If I can just jump in here one moment, and that's just to say, I started to say before, if you have a question that you're thinking of during the program, we recommend that you put it in the chat just so you don't forget it. And if we're running out of time, then Liz is going to ask those questions at the end. If there's enough time and she can see you on the screen, then you may have the opportunity to ask the question yourself. So Monica, take it away.
We'll see what happens here. Okay. Slideshow. This one. Oh, share. Okay. Can everybody see that? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, very good then. So hello to all of you, and thank you for being here this evening. It was more than 25 years ago now that I received a copy of the manuscript of Tea with an Old Dragon. Hatfield's own Jane Yolen had been asked by Smith College to write a children's book about the college's founder, Sophia Smith, another of Hatfield's own. I have to just know. Okay, there she is. To commemorate the bicentennial of her birth. The story Jane brought into being was masterful and delightful. Somehow she remembered that I had illustrated some books of folk tales in the very distant past, and knowing that I too was from Hatfield, she suggested that I be considered for the job of illustrating this book. I was thrilled when I learned that I had been chosen, although I had no idea what I was getting myself into. The book tells the story of the young daughter of the Reverend John M. Green, Louisa, who boldly visits the home of Sophia Smith, looking for the old dragon she had heard about from other children in town. Such was the reputation of Sophia Smith in Hatfield. To prepare for the task of illustrating the story, I read it over and over and over again. Some of the first images that came to mind, with a few changes, of course, ended up being illustrations. Others would require a lot more work. Then the research began. First, I was introduced to the Smith College archives, where her will and journal are housed, and then guided to the alumni house, where I was allowed to gaze upon and sketch and photograph some of the household possessions that once belonged to Sophia Smith, never imagining that one day, many of those very objects, including most of those seen here, would be returning to her hometown. The college's music department has her piano, and they kindly let me view it on more than one occasion. Then it was on to every library with which I was familiar, and most importantly, to the Hatfield Historical Museum, to see, among other things, the Smith family treasures housed there. Being as historically accurate as possible was very important to me, and the assistance given by the Historical Society was invaluable in achieving that end. My husband collects Western Massachusetts town histories, and they were a great help. I went with him, as I had done so many times before, into shops filled with old books, where I was now to discover such wonderful resources as Godey's Ladies' Books and books in which were reproduced the complete works of Currier and Ives. There were visits to the PVMA's Memorial Hall Museum, historic Deerfield, Sturbridge Village, and numerous art museums. Paintings, prints, and auction catalogs were pored over. Anything that could possibly contain any useful information about life in 1867 was studied. Notebooks quickly filled. Time was spent visiting the Smith family plot in the cemetery behind the Congregational Church and walking up and down Main Street, again sketching and taking photographs, and answering more than one resident's questions as to what was going on. Fortunately, most of those people knew me, knew that I had grown up here, and were aware that an artist does these things sometimes. Friends loaned china and silver. Relatives provided appropriate furniture. Many of those same friends and relatives were roped into posing, and they did it without complaint. The little girl who was the model for Louisa was, at first, more timid than I was, but soon we both warmed up to our task. It just so happened that during that time, a relative of my husband's lived in the house in which most of the story takes place. That made it easier to seek access to it, and the owners and occupants were extremely gracious and accommodating. In fact, most people seemed genuinely pleased to be a part of this project, and that made me a little less afraid to ask for help in subsequent undertakings of this kind. Even back then, before there was so much material readily available online, much more research could have been done. Mistakes were definitely made, but sketches for the illustrations had to be submitted for approval. There was then much discussion back and forth. Those in the book business wanted action, exaggeration of expression, and dragons. I could only give them images of a quieter time, dignity of character, and realism. Even if I had wanted to, it would have been impossible to change overnight the style of a lifetime of painting. There was a constant tug of war between what I felt about the story and knew I could accomplish, and what was expected in a contemporary illustration. Some compromises were made on both sides. The sketches were eventually approved, and the real work, the painting, was begun. The patience and trust of the college, the publishers, the author, and especially my husband during that time were greatly appreciated. At times it was frustrating and difficult, at others joyous and exhilarating, but always it was an honor to be a part of the making of this book. Now we will talk a little about the pictures that eventually came to illustrate it. This is the half title page, simply a cup of tea and a slice of ginger loaf. But because of my desire to be as accurate as possible and to use actual things whenever possible, I had to make some tea and a ginger loaf, neither of which, needless to say, went to waste. Here we have the title page. In this painting of Hatfield's Main Street, I had hoped to show how the town might have looked in 1867. Pictured here are some old photographs that were very helpful. The church is still standing, but the town hall burned down long ago. John M. Green, as minister of the church, and his family would have lived in the house on the right. On to the dedication page. This painting is based on the previously seen full-length photograph of Sophia Smith. I think it is telling the way she wore her headgear. Most ladies of the day, and of a certain age, let the sides of their lace caps hang down dowdily around their jowls, but not Sophia Smith. She chose a more daring method, and I think a more becoming one. It appears that she might have been interested in the latest fashion as well as in the latest architecture. New England asters seemed the best accompaniment here, as they work nicely with her lavender ribbons. In this, the first illustration of the story, it was necessary to introduce some of the characters, locate them in time and place, and indicate the time of year. The children of the minister, Hatfield's most respected citizen, would have been dressed as well and as neatly as possible. Very little boys were still put in dresses in 1867, and capes with loads of trim were worn by both women and girls. Red was frequently used for little girls' dresses and was chosen as the color of Louisa's dress, not only for its visual impact, but also because it is bold and lively, as was Louisa herself. The first sketches of this scene had very little action in them, and more was requested. I, on the other hand, did not think that it would be harmful to see children playing quietly. The resulting picture was an acceptable compromise. The models are the grandchildren of our Hatfield neighbors. It seemed right that Hatfield children should be used as models for this story. I got into a little trouble with this one. In the sketch for it, I had the horse and carriage traveling from right to left, which is how they would have been seen, if heading out, by Louisa from her front yard. But there turned out to be a preference in publishing, unbeknownst to me, that actions such as these go from left to right. This does make perfect page-turning sense. And then there was the dust. I had never painted dust before and knew that I could not portray as much dust as was required. This was as much dust as I could muster, and it would have to do. Here we are trying, alas in vain, to generate some of the stuff. Sophia's carriage was said to be big, so a double phaeton, something the Smith family might have had when they were all still alive, was used. I couldn't see her buying a new one when this one was quite serviceable. Early on, when this picture was on exhibit elsewhere, a woman came up to me and said that training carriage horses was what she did. I remember thinking, uh-oh, here comes a welcome, but nonetheless embarrassing correction. She said that most artists get it all wrong, and that was what she was expecting, but that somehow, miraculously, I had gotten it right. The lesson learned was a very good one concerning the importance of research in the illustration of things historical. There is always going to be someone out there who knows everything there is to know about everything, be it bonnets or bridles, and they will not hesitate to let you know if you have erred. It would have been appropriate to use a Bible from the Smith family as a model for this spot illustration, but unfortunately, one was not available to me at the time. In this illustration of Mrs. Green scolding Louisa, it was suggested that the little girl should be shown defiantly stamping her foot, but I could not imagine a child of that time doing such a thing. I had first drawn Louisa, just taking her punishment, hands joined behind her back, her face showing all of her frustration. The final picture is, again, a compromise, and it turned out to be a good thing that she is showing some displeasure with her body language, as in the printing of the book, much of her facial expression was wiped out. Printing is so much better now. This would most likely no longer be a problem. I have removed Louisa and her mother from the dining room for the scolding and placed them in the hallway. Mrs. Green, although probably not quite as blonde as I made her, was a well-educated woman, having graduated from what was then called the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. Above all, however, she had to be a practical and thrifty minister's wife and mother to her children. Clothing for the whole family would probably have been made by her. Her own dress is based on one from 1866 in the collection of the Memorial Hall Museum. Here is a friend helping me out and a very rough sketch of that dress at the bottom right. Although of appropriate fabric and trim, it may have been reworked from a slightly earlier garment. 1865 was a year of change in fashion, and by 1867, some of those changes would have been showing up even in the small but well-to-do town of Hatfield. The square neck of the child's dress is a nod to such a change in fashion, but as she was known, especially by her mother, to be somewhat of a tomboy, there was no lace for Louisa. Her hem was constructed so that it could be let down as she grew. Throughout the book, I took what I knew about the people and what material goods were available to them at the time, and made choices I thought they might have made. Those choices are borne out in many period photographs and paintings. Hair on girls up to the age of 6 was left to hang down to be tucked behind the ears, as seen in this slightly earlier photo. Then, after 6, it would have been put up like their mothers. Louisa, however, would probably have wished to be free of such constraints for as long as possible. The cat that appears in these illustrations was our cat Eddie. He was a good and willing model, which was quite extraordinary, as he was a completely wild boy when he came to us. Cats seemed to be very much loved during Victorian times, if paintings of that era are to be believed. They are included in depictions of even the most luxurious interiors. As there was not much going on here, I tried to create some interest through the use of pattern and color. For illustrations that would spread over 2 pages, one had to be careful not to put anything important in the fold. The house pictured across the street stands there still. This spot illustration of acorns and oak leaves echoes the carving found at the top of the columns on Sophia Smith's front porch. Acorns and oak leaves are everywhere one steps in the autumn in New England. To me, they and their source are symbols of strength and endurance, and thus of Sophia Smith herself. This house has wonderful detail. When I was working on this project, it had been recently painted, and I was told that in the scraping done beforehand, it was discovered to have been a mustard color originally, and later a barn red. I went with the mustard, although for the purpose of making more of a visual impact, I chose Goulden's hot dog as opposed to the French country Dijon that was probably more like the actual color used then. Oh, here you have the slightly untidy, cranky maid. This is a feeling and a look that I know well, but that is not why I used myself as a model. A sketch was needed right away, and not only was there too little time in which to do it, but curiously, none of my friends was available for this one. The maid was most likely Irish, and quite possibly the Mary Harney who had, according to Sophia's will, formerly lived with her, and to whom she left the sum of $100. I imagined that perhaps Sophia had also given her the pin she wears at her neck, a piece of Italian mosaic jewelry that had been fashionable just a little before that time. Here are a couple of similar looks from 1865. Sophia Smith's house still sits there with its roof sloping like a farmer's hat, as Jane Yolen so aptly described it. I got the impression that, as time went on, Sophia had regrets about building it, believing it to have been not the best use of her money. When the initial sketch for this illustration was seen, it was suggested to me that the figures should all be put together in the middle of the hallway, but I really insisted on this composition. To me, the moment that was most important was that in which the maid stepped aside, Sophia appeared, and the child and Sophia made eye contact. What was happening in the seemingly empty space between them was as worthy of depiction as anything else could have been. This composition also left a space in which to delineate Sophia's shadow. The shadow she casts here could be said to represent the beneficial impact that her foresight and generosity would have on young women's lives in the future. As family was of great importance to her, I thought that she might have hung some portraits of her relatives in the entryway where they could keep an eye on visitors. In this illustration, it was necessary to convey the small size and the growing fear of the child as she waited by herself in the front hall. It was also an opportunity, as it was in the previous picture and in several of the upcoming illustrations, to decorate Miss Smith's house using what was still there and making choices from what would have been available in the 1860s. In one of the decorating books from the period, there was a wonderful color harmony chart from which homeowners could coordinate their decorating schemes. If, say, the carpet was what was then called Indian red or Indian yellow, dark olive was the only way to go with wallpaper. The frieze had to be Indian yellow, the ceiling écru, and the woodwork very dark. Such is the way I went. This is a before and after look at the previous illustration. And here is the before and after of this one. One can contrast this house and its decoration with that of the minister who lived in what was offered to him and his family by the church. Here is wallpaper rather than the stenciling of another era, gilt as opposed to simple wooden frames, carpeting instead of a painted floor and floor cloth, fine woods where there would have been common pine. But there is also a cool formality here, as opposed to the wear and warmth of the older home. This picture introduces to the reader Miss Smith's mysterious listening device. Her dress is based on what she is wearing in her full-length photograph. The fine silk is very much in fashion, as are the high waistline, narrow sleeves, and the lack of gathers at the waist. The shape of women's skirts had recently changed in order to use less fabric. This was a consequence of the Civil War. The Hatfield Historical Museum has Miss Smith's curious hearing tube in its collection. Here is Rita Prue, who was at the time curator of the museum, demonstrating how it was used. You have no idea how difficult it is to get an egg to splat, especially when you are trying to make that happen. After at least a dozen eggs had been gone through, this version had to do. I really enjoyed working on this one. Here the reader first sees Sophia Smith's magnificent piano, as well as a number of her things that I had seen at the Alumni House, particularly admired and really wanted to use somewhere in the book. Sophia would, upon advisement most likely, have filled her new home with the most up-to-date furnishings, but I tried to put myself in her place and imagined that she might have insisted on bringing with her, for reasons both practical and sentimental, furniture pieces from the family homestead next door. Hence the mirror and the tall chest reflected in it, both of which are from an earlier and simpler time, before she was burdened with the responsibility of her inheritance, and both of which are returning to Hatfield, where they started out. The fireplace with its carved S likely still adorns the north front room of the house. The painting I imagined hanging over it is a partial copy of one attributed to Victor de Grailly, who did many such paintings based on contemporary prints of the Connecticut River Valley. This view looks north from Mount Holyoke, and in the original, Hatfield is distinctly visible about halfway up and on the left, although it is depicted as a shining metropolis. Perhaps Miss Smith would not have gone to the expense of buying such a painting, but it is appropriate, I think, for the time and for the place. And it is included as a reminder of how important this valley was to artists of that era, particularly to those of the Hudson River School. It was suggested that, in her joy at discovering the piano, Louisa should be touching it. However, I felt that even a child as bold as Louisa would have been taught to look, but don't touch, especially in 1867. This illustration, to be what would have been considered a good one in the world of children's books, should probably have had Miss Smith jumping up and down and Louisa pounding on the keys. I chose, however, to have the design of the piano and the emerging benevolence of Sophia Smith be of importance here. The intricate beauty of the piano's music holder and the rich grain of the wood called out for emphasis. In order to obtain a reflection of the child, it was necessary to have a light wallpaper. Yellow and white stripes, again according to the rules of Victorian decoration, were often used. For this room, I varied only slightly in design and color, the wallpaper of about the same date that was found in the William Cullen Bryant homestead in Cummington. Heavy red drapery was then required, but I didn't think that Sophia Smith would have used the recommended black bear rug. This may be how this illustration ended up, but this is how it started out, with sketches about the size of postage stamps. As tea was being served in the less formal kitchen, and as the guest was a child, the best tea service and the fanciest chairs were not what would have been called for. China that had served the daily needs of the Smith family for years was more suitable for this occasion. Chairs from Sophia Smith's old house might have been used in the kitchen of her new house, and they would have been less affected by the squirming of little girls. For this picture, dear friends generously loaned their Canton china and their magnificent silver cake basket, that one special touch for the occasion. As Canton was commonly used, it seemed quite possible that the Smiths would have been familiar with it. I truly love the decorative qualities of these beautiful blue and white dishes, and this picture is an example of how I sometimes would concoct a story in order to justify putting something that I really wanted to include into a composition. The green and white transferware platter in the cupboard once belonged to Sophia Smith and has long been in the collection of the Hatfield Historical Museum. The view out the window on the right has not changed much since Sophia Smith's time. It is hoped that it never will. Here are the Greens leaving Hatfield for the Reverend's new posting in South Hadley. The horses are rigged for a heavy load and wintry conditions. The main street of Hatfield also appears today, much as it did in the late 1860s. This spot illustration, the image on the top, was painted from studies done of the rose planted at the gravesite of Sophia Smith. It had been hybridized by a Smith College chemistry professor, especially for the 200th anniversary of her birth, but unfortunately, it has since disappeared. And here we are back to the cover. It may be the first thing one sees, but it was the last painting to be done. Right up until the end, it was thought that one of the illustrations from the interior of the book might work here, but none did. The book's designer suggested this composition, and I think she was right, especially as it allows for all of the necessary writing. The identity of the dragon is not completely given away, and it is hoped that enough mystery remains to tempt a reader to open up the book and find out just what is going on. Well, that's it for the book. If you are here this evening, you more than likely have an interest in the history of Hatfield. Sophia Smith was a major part of that history, and we in town are very fortunate to have been the recipients of the gift of many of her possessions by the Smith College Alumni Association. I look forward to viewing them and many more of Hatfield's artifacts displayed for all to see, hopefully on the second floor of the town hall, which has long been designated for use by the Hatfield Historical Museum for much needed accessible space. Now on to Meg Baker, the museum's assistant curator, who will talk with great expertise about some very special items from Sophia Smith's early years that have now joined Hatfield's wonderful collection. Thank you. Stop share.
My goodness. That was entirely charming. I'm so moved.
Oh, is this on my back?
Yep.
We're all back? Okay.
We're all back.
Okay.
So I will carry on from that point, although I have to feel as though I need to take a moment because it's just such a delightful story, and thank you so much. I am afraid that mine will not be as lovely to look at because we'll be looking largely at the inside of some pieces of Sophia's work as a child. And definitely, if you do have questions that you want to put in the chat now for Monica's wonderful first half, please feel free to do that while I get my screen share going here. Okay. How's that, Kathy? Are we looking, everybody can see that okay?
All good.
Okay, great. So one of the things that I wanted to do is focus on Sophia as a child. It's so wonderful to see Monica's depiction of Sophia as the old dragon with this little girl. And part of what we are so lucky to have in Hatfield in the collection right now is artifacts from Sophia's life when she was that little girl. And so tonight I'm going to show you a few of those items. Textiles are my specific background, so that is what I have focused on. The rose has become a sort of icon, a symbol of Sophia Smith in a certain way. And so I wanted to start out with this little image, this little piece of roses that she stitched as a child. So these lovely faded roses now surround her family register, which is a sort of a sampler that lists the names of all of her family and important dates in their life. And as Monica mentioned, family was very important to Sophia. So it's wonderful that we have this sampler that she made when she was herself just a little girl. Here it is in full. She was born in 1796 and stitched this probably when she was about 9 years old. One of the ways we can date samplers is just by looking at the dates that appear and then figuring it had to have happened after that date. Sometimes a girl will note on the sampler how old she is or the year in which she's made it. This particular sampler has been framed or was framed for a very, very long time. And you can see that one of the things that's happened is it's sort of distorted. There's this little swoop in the name box and a little bit of a swoop up in the text. So we knew right away when we saw this that this was an absolute treasure, a piece of Sophia's life that we don't usually look at is her childhood. A lot of what I know, especially not growing up in Hatfield, of Sophia's life begins with her inheritance and what she did after that. So this really lays the groundwork for me of her love of family and her commitment to her family, is to have taken the time to do this. There's a couple details, though, worth pointing out. Places where the box around the flower, around the rose, was not perfectly done. Places where the pattern didn't line up. And this is a very common thing because the fabric that they were using wasn't machine perfect the way a cross-stitch fabric would be today. One of the other things we have in the collection now, newly, thanks to this, is a little porcelain doll, and the clothing is all handmade with simple stitching. And this sort of needlework, making doll clothes and making a sampler of some kind, were very common things that a girl would learn. Needlework skills are very important in this era. It's how you clothe your family. It's how you track the use of things in the home. And the process of learning those skills might be a trade-off with the parents of, all right, make the doll clothes, then we'll get you the doll. so that each child developed a sort of process of appreciating their own skills, and that their own skills could lead them to better things and more skills. So this doll, one of the things we notice here is that the skirt is very worn. This is one of the evidences of light damage, and it's also faded. The color on the fabric print is much more clear on the underneath, and you can really see the line of stitching. But this is very likely a child stitching. It's absolutely possible that Sophia's mother or some other person could have made this dress for her doll, and just made it in a very simple, quick way. But it's not impossible at all that this could have been also made by her. We also have in our collection Sophia Smith's neighbor's sampler. Hannah Wells lived across the street, and eventually wound up marrying Sophia Smith's brother. So there were lots of little girls who learned to make samplers in this style. Hannah Wells did put her name and date on the bottom. I think I have a close-up. Let me see. Nope, I don't. I'm sorry for that. But she was 11 years old, and she completed the sampler August 26, 1806. So it was at least contemporary with when Sophia was making her sampler, possibly even at the same time, because so many of the motifs are so similar. It's the same rows in the same double outline of black stitching. The same font is used, and there are different fonts that get used in samplers. The same font is used, and they have the same box around the name as sort of the nameplate. So there's a lot of similarity. They're making them at the same time. The chances of them at least knowing about each other's sampler is very clear. This little label on the bottom side of the sampler conveniently covers a place where Hannah's stitching is also a little uneven. So these are learning pieces for both of them. One of the things that we commonly get told about samplers is that these were the sort of sum, expectation, and total of girls' education. And one of the things that I want to convey here is that there's so much math going on for these girls in figuring out what's the right repeat of these motifs. How do I enlarge the motif or shrink the motif as needed? Because these are practical skills that they're learning. It's not just a decorative part. The back of Hannah's sampler, here you can see where the stitching is uneven in the way that she's calculated it. The back of Hannah's sampler has old, very thin, almost like a shingle of wood, very thin slice of wood, which is very typical of the time. This frame, if it's not authentic to the era, it's very close. And we are very, very glad to have these two examples in the collection. You can see a little bit of where the heavy tannic oak based, Monica mentioned oak, and oak will make a really nice dark dye. And here it's bled out into the linen a bit. Hannah's sampler has a back. Now we're getting to Sophia's sampler. Sophia's sampler came to us with no back, which implies to me perhaps that it had been reframed once already. And it gave us an opportunity to consider reframing it for the best care of the object. That's always our goal at the museum. It arrived in the museum without any sort of backing board or sealing of any kind. And as you can see here at the bottom, the cloth of the front of the sampler was just folded over the cardboard and held against the nails. So I always like to say, whatever anyone has done in the past that allows an object to come through to now is good. I never have anything negative to say about work that people have done in the past that allows an object to continue to exist, because everyone's always doing the best they can with the resources and knowledge they have at the time. So this is magnificent that this has come to us. Here you can see a close-up. They use some sort of adhesive. This is very common for pieces of the era because they're looking to just put something up that they're kid made that they're proud of, but it's not the same sort of archival techniques that we would use. We don't have at the Hatfield Historical Museum the sort of really a chemical lab that we would need to assess exactly what kind of adhesive this is and how best to remove that adhesive. So we had to figure out what we could do within our means. But obviously, we couldn't remove the nails. They're a little rusty. There were also water spots on the back of the board. And at this stage, I hadn't yet removed the piece from the frame. So I was just really hoping that those water spots were from any sort of contact with the wall, condensation on a wall over the many, many, many years it had been on exhibit and had not damaged the cloth. So here is at the beginning of the process of taking these out. This nail right here had actually gone, you can see it, it had gone under a couple of threads of cloth. And so I was so intent on removing it very carefully that I forgot to take a picture of it beforehand. So now it's out of the frame. Very thrilled to have it come out and be able to see all the edges, but it's still attached to the board. The warping is very, very clear across the top. It's like just not square and even. And there's also, again, the warping along the lines of text, and it's still attached to the old board. So that was the next process. Then this was a several step process. And first was assessing what it needed, then removing it carefully, and then, at each step, really taking the time to see what was necessary to do the best possible work for this piece. So after that assessment, this is what we determined. This is what I determined, that the adhesive was dry enough, very almost flaking away, that I was able to use this very thin little spatula, and it has a very round tip. There's no point going in there. It's a very, little rounded tip to just release the fabric from the cardboard. We were very relieved about that. Okay. Along the sides, there was just the narrowest bead of glue. And this is great because I've definitely dealt with samplers like this of the same era where the entire back surface is covered with adhesive. And there's no way to remove it easily, safely, simply from the backing board. So even up to this point of this process, I didn't know whether we were going to be able to remove the acidic old cardboard and replace it with a new archival material. So this was magnificent to me, and to move just really slowly, just loosening each thread, one thread at a time along the side to bring it free of that board. And I was so relieved when there wasn't any additional adhesive. So here's the back of the work. This is one of the things that I love to see and to show in doing textile conservation work, because we so often get to see the front of the work. This is a little bit like my equivalent of Monica's sketches of what it looked like beforehand. This is a way we get to sort of see what it looked like beforehand, and then it gets framed up, and we'll never see this again until sometime down in the future, 100 or 200 years from now, someone does this again, which I hope they do. So one of the things to look at here is all these long looping tails of thread. If you do cross stitch, if you know what needlework looks like on the back of the front, you can begin to sense how she was making this, and like where she had to secure a new thread in, and where she decided that it was okay, like right here, there's where it was okay to just carry her thread from the end of one word across to the next word. So you start to learn some things about what her thought process was in making this sampler. You can tell a little bit sometimes about how frugal someone is if they're, when they're making their choices of can I afford to carry that thread across the back? Can I afford to leave a long tail? Do I want to, cut this as short as possible and use every bit? There's a lot of interesting things you can begin to infer from looking at the back. The darkest threads are the ones also that are shedding off the most fibers. This is the fibers are a mix. They're like there's linen and cotton fibers. In some times and places, might have done a burn test, which is where you take a little tiny bit of the fiber and you can burn it. And a plant-based fiber will smell like burning plants, burning wood. An animal-based fiber like wool or silk will smell like burning hair, and a synthetic fiber will melt. But this is far too precious to do any sort of like, oh, well, I'll just snip this little bit off and do this burn test. Didn't do any of that. I know it's a linen ground. I know that the threads are mostly linen, like a cotton blend. There's not silk threads in it, but there could have been at that time, but she wasn't using silk, maybe because she's a child and she's just doing this sampler and they weren't letting her use silks that were available. And again, this is all like tannic dye from an oak tree. And so that's harsh on fibers. And so they're shedding a little. All right, next slide. One of the things you can see on the back is that there's more color, and it doesn't even show up as much in the slide as I would like it to. Here you can see a little bit of the residue of the one thin bead of adhesive. And the colors on this, there's like peaches and greens and whites, and there's some sort of goldy, orangey colors. It's just really wonderful to have all of these different colors. So the flowers and roses originally weren't vividly colored like some of the samplers that we've seen and have had a lot of light damage, but they were a little brighter and they would have had a little bit more contrast in each rose. They would have had the flower and then the background a little more clear. All right. One of the other things that we noticed when I took it off the board was we could see the thin places in the linen. And that's part of the process that happens when you have a hand-woven material of hand-spun thread, is that just in the natural variation of the textile, you have these places of wear. And you, of course, can refine that. There are things that are extremely, extremely consistent, even from 100 years or more before this. So that gives me the sense that this is really a learning piece, a test piece, that this ground fabric isn't the highest precision of weaving or spinning. So it's actually theoretically possible that this is something she could have woven or spun herself, because that was something that would have been within her framework of learning textile arts and learning domestic budgeting and frugality. Even if it wasn't something that she needed to do all the time, it's still, in this time, something that is a good idea to learn. So a little piece of linen, and here's where we get to see it best. Here's a better detail, and this of the colors. This I particularly love because you can begin to get an impression of what colors she put in first. The stitch layers really reveal the stages of work, because the one that's on the bottom, and it has lots of other threads going over it, is generally the one that went in earlier. So we can make some inferences about how these threads may have been laid down. Obviously, it's possible that a thread that you're putting in later, accidentally hooks under a different thread. But when you have consistently, like all these little green threads, little green stitches are underneath all of these yellow threads, that's a pretty good bet that those were put down first. It also allows you to see some places where she was filling in the background with one thread and then ran out of that color thread, and so picked another color that was close enough. So again, it's a lot of estimating things carefully, using things carefully, and you can tell where she picked up the work again. It's really, I find it really charming. Okay, yeah. So one of the things that we also noticed was exactly how much that tannic thread had affected the cardboard. And this is acidic cardboard, which is damaging to textiles and anything else that they're near, that's paper goods. And the black tannic threads have left a mark on the cardboard, and the much lighter threads have left residue on the glass. And this was something I don't see this very often. So this is really kind of a neat little tiny peek into the story of this piece. Stabilizing the sampler was pretty straightforward. Once I got it out, the old cardboard was removed, and the first challenge was to find an archival backing board that was thick enough to go in the pockets, because those could not be unfolded. I couldn't soften them down. So I wound up modifying a piece of archival mat board and just really making sure that there were no square edges that would dig into the textile at any point anywhere. Took a clean rag and softened all the corners. Then I made a twill tape pocket. Ordinarily, a good treatment for the textile would be to lay it absolutely flat and then sew it to a backing board that had been covered with archival fabric. But this, because of the pockets, I couldn't lay it flat. So instead, I used the twill tape at the top and bottom. There's almost no overlap at the sides because there was no overlap in the original. And I decided that that was best to leave it as is. So that's left. So twill tapes measured and put in place. Did I skip the slide? Yeah, okay. There's a line of stitching all the way around the work. And this is something that needle workers still do when they're doing cross stitch. It gives you a boundary to sort of center your work from, and it gives a sort of definite edge. And if you're working on a frame, that gives you a good place to secure it. And I aim to use that as a guideline to straighten the whole piece, because it would have been put in as a straight line of stitching along one thread, and aim to get that precision back, or at least as much as I could. So the twill tape I stitched on just outside the guideline, and making it really visible is important in conservation work, because I want, if it ever needs to be done again, I want someone to be able to see very easily what I did and understand why, and able to remove it if need be. So I kept the stitches really even, and I've put the twill tape sewn down to the edge, and that creates a pocket that I can put the mat board in. And the mat board has a little bit of thickness to it, so I sewed the twill tape to the mat board. So each edge of the pocket is stitched through the side of the new mat board, and that helps keep them secure and helps tension the twill tape across the top and bottom without adding any additional stress to the textile. I didn't want to sew the twill tape around, too much to the front. Just keeping track of that top line allows me to help level the textile. The sides don't have a pocket option. The distortion isn't as severe, so I didn't adjust them. This is really the only place where there's a lot of that distortion. And one of the situations that Monica spoke of was the compromise needed between her vision and the publisher's needs. And the compromises I had to make were between my vision and the realities of the textile. After the twill was secure, then I can basically fine tune it. So here's the textile supported onto the twill tape. And then in order to get the leveling I needed, I can tension into the twill tape without putting additional tension and stress on the textile, because that's already supported by the twill tape. So that's what this winds up looking like. It's a little bit like a drum. If you've ever tightened a drum, or had to get something else that was perfectly balanced, make this network of points so that I'm straightening the twill tape and not putting pressure points on the textile. Then there's always the labeling. I want, again, to document everything. It's part of the historian thing. Document everything and make sure that when someone opens this up in the future, they will know when it was done and why it was done and where it was done and by whom it was done. Because one of the things that's wonderful is to have that sort of information. So when we open up anything at the museum and we have any piece of that, it is such a help. So that's why I put all the information there, documenting the work so that anyone knows I did this as part of my work for the Hatfield Historical Museum. And yep, there we go. So this is what the exhibit at the museum looks like, very close to this now, with Monica's wonderful book and all of these artifacts from Sophia Smith's house and her childhood sampler, all united again. And I am so thrilled to have been part of this. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Hatfield Historical Museum, and Kathy, and all of you here. And I'm now going to end my screen share and turn it over to questions. And first to Kathy Gow, who I think has some final words.
Actually, I think we're going to go next to Liz, and we're running a little behind here, so we understand if people need to duck out before the questions, but they probably won't take that long. So Liz, do we have any questions in the chat yet? If not, we can open it up to the floor.
We do not. We have some wonderful comments, which the presenter should read about how fantastic it was to see this whole process of how you, Meg, went through this and saw this, the mind of Sophia, how she went about doing it and what was going on was really fascinating. And people love that book and want to know where to get a hold of the book, Monica. So you have to somehow let us know where we can obtain copies. But mostly people were just very, very complimentary about both of you and thanked you. And then one person also reported that you got the horses' physiques absolutely correct. I think that was Betsy who said that. Her dad was a vet, and so that you did a good job with the horses in the book. But that was really pretty much it for questions. Yes, Kathy.
So I have a question for Monica. So I love the fact that you have illustrated yourself in the book as the cross, Irish maid or whatever. But so I'm curious, it's also like a bit of humor to have yourself pictured in the book. I'm wondering if you have done that in your other books.
Yes, but not as uncomplimentary.
Because I think that's a wonderful element to have.
Well, it really was that everything had to be done so quickly. Even Jane, in writing the book, had said that that the amount of time that she was given to write the book was very, very short. And so everything was kind of, you did the best you could with what you had. And that was what we got out of it.
I have a question for you, if you don't mind. There's the page where the little girl is being scolded.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some wonderful images in the paintings up above that. And I just wondered what they were, if you recall.
Well, I was thinking that at the time that Mrs. Green being, she was kind of a woman of the world herself, and that she would have had paintings in her house. One was a landscape that would have been contemporary from that era. One was it was some kind of a photograph. The man, it was found in our house, and we aren't really sure who it is, but it seemed to be of about the right time. And another one was a painting that was much later, but I kind of put it in there for fun because the publishers were from Pennsylvania, and it was a landscape of a place in Pennsylvania. So it didn't really belong, but that's one of those little things you get to do.
I love that you described the different ways that you added things that were important. That's great. Thank you.
It was really, I have to just say, I was just captivated by the way you handled the black fabric that Sophia is wearing. It is so hard to illustrate black fabric, and I'm like, oh my gosh, wonderful. And also really, really just could not take my eyes off. And I've looked at this book so many times. The wood, when the shot from the top looking down, when you've got the banister curving and the little girl down there, and it's just astonishing. Like the sheen on it, the little bits of dust on the wood. I was very impressed. It was really nice to see it with your commentary.
Well, it was, that one was fun. That was the image one of the images that came into my mind at the first reading of the book. So it was nice that they let me in and that I was able to, make that picture that way.
As far as people who are interested in getting the book, we used to have a small stack of them at the museum, but a few visits by Smith College alumni on alumni weekend wiped out that stock pretty quickly. And I have a kind of ongoing search on eBay so that if the book turns up, it'll show up in my eBay search feed. And so if you're interested in the book, you might want to do that. At one point, there did turn up a handful of books, and they were at a good price, and I bought them so that we could sell them in the museum to people coming to visit. But I haven't seen any turn up in a while. So yes, Monica, if you happen to know of any private stash of someone who's willing to sell them or something, let us know.
No, I wish I did, but I don't. People ask often, and I have no idea. I think it's somehow sold out, and you can get them online, but the prices vary quite a bit. So I think, people have actually paid more for them than they probably should have, but they've been able to get them online. But the Alumni House had a stash too, but I don't know what happened to those.
I just did a search on Amazon, and there are some used copies available if anyone's interested. I'm getting one. Stay away till the end so I can get my
I just got 2 from Thrift Books. They are in very, very good condition. I think some of them are new. And tomorrow I will return the one from the Children's Library back to Hatfield Library.
Great.
I'm feeling guilty. Right.
I also just wanted to say, I think we mentioned it at the beginning and in the write-up for this piece, but the sampler, Sophia Smith sampler, and the doll, and a lot of other things were donated last year, just about this time, earlier in April, from the Alumni Association of Smith College, from their Smith College collection. And it was a hard decision for them to make, but in the end, the Alumni Association is not a museum, and they decided that it would be better for the artifacts to be, displayed, first of all, in the town that they came from, and by an institution that could take care of them in a museum setting. And I think, the work that Meg was able to do, which we're so lucky to have Meg working in the Hatfield Historical Museum, and very soon to be the new curator, with her textile skills, because that is not something that's easy to come by. So to have someone, in town working for the Historical Society to take care of our textiles in this way is really a treasure. So any other questions out there? Okay, then I'm going to quick share my screen.
I
All
can
right.
see the
Yep.
logo.
You're
good.
So you can see it. Okay. So
Good.
the 2 logos. So again, it's just to let people know that this program was sponsored by Mass Humanities Bridge Street Fund by a grant from them. And so we're very thankful for that, for their generous grant. And to learn more about local humanities events, we encourage you to sign up for the Mass Humanities newsletter, and the link for that is on the screen. So you can either write that down, or when this program has been recorded, so when it goes up on our YouTube channel, you can go there and look for the link there, or you can just Google Mass Humanities newsletter and you'll get there straight away. That would be easier. So if you enjoyed tonight's program, I just encourage you to either to consider making a donation to the Hatfield Historical Society, and you can either do that by sending us a check or by going online. We have like a donate button, and then a donate page where it'll give you the information. You could send something in. This would help us do more programs like this in the future, as well as continue to do the work of saving and sharing Hatfield history. This stuff doesn't happen by itself, and we're very lucky to be able to do it with the support of the Hatfield Historical Society and with support from the town of Hatfield and the Historical Commission. But it does take fundraising, each year to keep things going. So, and if you're not a member, please consider joining. And if you get a fundraising letter from us and update, which will probably be coming at the end of May, we encourage you to respond to that. So that's my little pitch, and we thank you all so much for coming. It's great to see your faces, and we really hope that some or all of you can join us at our annual meeting on May 19th. That's going to be in person at the Hatfield Congregational Church, and the program is going to be on family farming. So that's a family affair celebrating multi-generational farms in Hatfield. And we think it's going to be a really exciting program. And we're going to have refreshments, and you can welcome the new curator in person and say goodbye to the old one in person. And we would love to have you there. So thanks everyone for coming. Bye.
Thank you. Wonderful program.
Thank you. Great job.
Absolutely wonderful. Great job.
Feel free to send us little email messages about what you thought of the program, especially if you'd be willing to, let us use those in on the website or something, because it's great to get those comments. And it's great to send them back to funders as well.
Thanks, Kathy.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Wonderful evening.
Bye.
Yes. Wasn't it fun?
Yes.
Good. That's good.
Great.
I just purchased a copy of the book on Amazon.
Oh,
it is
good for
available.
you.
Good.
Me too.
You are a better,
That's
a
great.
better
Might have highlighter, it
multitasker
says,
than
but
I
At
am.
least I can have it now. I must own this thing now.
It's a wonderful book. It really
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
So in purchasing the book, Kathy, I left your page where the links are. Is that up on, where can I find that?
Well, that's because I closed my screen.
Okay,
The link was really just to the our website, hatfieldhistory.weebly.com, and also
All
to
right.
the Mass Humanities newsletter. And if you just
Okay.
search on Mass Humanities newsletter, you'll find that. It'll be up
Okay.
once this
All
is
right.
posted, once the program is posted on YouTube, but
sure.
I don't know as you
Gotta
need to
get the
wait for
book.
that.
Thank you. Thank you both,
Thank you.
all of you.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, Kristen.
So you two should definitely read the chat comments because they're wonderful.
It was really sweet.
Yeah, they're not questions. They're just comments about how great you both are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say, like we said in the intro notes, we know so little about what Sophia was really like, other than her letters to John Green, that
Yeah.
it's wonderful to be able to come at her from these different kind of directions,
I'm
Yeah.
so excited about potentiality, like down the road, of just doing something, and maybe this is just selfish on my part, just doing something of looking at her life through fashion and textiles, because we have, her sampler, we have her doll, we have some pieces of her dress, we have actual dress, we have another sampler that she collected at some point. It's just we have a couple
Yeah.
other pieces of textiles. It'd be really, really fun to do that.
I really would. I bet Smith has other stuff too that they'd even lend to something like that.
I don't know.
I don't know about
Yeah.
Lend, but they
Yeah.
might let her come over and study things over there kind of.
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
We're gonna close. It's past 7:45. Thank you guys all for joining us. It's
It was
been
a treat.
great. And we hope to see you next time.
Sounds
Okay.
good. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.